No enemy defeated them. No battle broke them. Yet they vanished without a trace. This is the chilling mystery of the lost army of the desert. The desert is never silent. When the wind rises, it sings through the dunes like 1,000 ghostly flutes, carrying with it voices from centuries past. On nights when the moon spills silver across the endless sand, travelers whisper of a lost army, 50,000 men who marched into the heart of the Sahara and was swallowed whole. It was the year 525 before Christ. Persia, the mightiest empire under the heavens, stretched from the mountains of Asia to the shores of the Nile. Its king, Cambyses II, a man whose temper was as fierce as the desert sun, demanded conquest. His gaze turned toward the sacred oasis of Siwar, where priests of Amun dared to question his rule. To silence them, he unleashed a host so vast that the earth trembled beneath their sandals. Imagine it, bronze shields flashing like molten fire, or banners snapping in the wind, endless columns of men and camels threading into the horizon. Their songs of victory echoed against the dunes, and the desert seemed to bow before their might. Yet beyond the horizon, beyond the last well, the last patch of green, lay nothing but seas of shifting sand, treacherous as any ocean. Bedouins who guided them warned, "The desert is alive. It devours the proud. Even kings cannot command the wind." But Cambyses laughed, dismissing them with a wave of his jeweled hand. And so they marched, 50,000 strong, into a silence so deep it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. What happened next would become one of history's most haunting mysteries. Day after day, the Persian host pressed deeper into the golden wilderness. At first, the desert seemed almost merciful, dawns painted in crimson fire, nights shimmering beneath an ocean of stars. The soldiers joked around their campfires, confident that Siwar would soon fall and their king's wrath would be satisfied. But the desert has a way of changing its face. The air grew drier, the wells scarcer. Sand crept into their food, their water, their lungs. Camels groaned and collapsed, their great bodies swallowed by dunes. The horizon stretched endlessly, shimmering with mirages, phantom rivers, cities made of glass, forests that vanished when men reached for them. Still, Cambyses would not turn back. He rode at the front on a white horse, his eyes fixed on the invisible oasis that lay ahead. His generals muttered among themselves. "The maps are lies," one whispered. "The gods of Egypt are cursing us," another swore. Yet none dared defy the son of Cyrus, for his rage was swifter than the scimitar. One evening, as the sun sank into a sea of blood-red sand, a storm gathered on the horizon. At first it was only a line of darkness, rolling low and heavy across the earth. Then came the roar, like mountains grinding together, as a wall of dust rose higher than any fortress. The desert wind screamed, tearing banners to shreds, smothering torches, drowning the army in choking clouds. Men clutched their comrades' hands, but when the storm passed, those hands were gone. The dunes had shifted. Parts erased. The army, 50,000 strong, was now a host wandering blind, swallowed by a desert with no mercy. And the whispers began. Whispers that something more than wind was stalking them in the night. The desert was no longer an empty stage. It had become a labyrinth. Dunes rose and fell like waves of a restless sea, reshaping with every gust. The Persians tried to march by the stars, but even the constellations seemed to drift in the haze of heat. Men swore that the sky itself was betraying them. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. Water skins hung flat, lips split and bleeding under the sun. Yet worse than thirst was the fear. Soldiers began to vanish, not in battle, not before witnesses, but silently, as if plucked from the earth. A man would lie beside his comrades at dusk and be gone by dawn, leaving only an impression in the sand. Around the fires, whispers grew bold. The priests of Amun have cursed us. Others muttered of jinn, spirits of the desert who lured travelers into the dunes with illusions of shade and water. One night, a scout stumbled back to camp raving, eyes wide with terror. They walk beside us. Thousands of them, pale soldiers with empty eyes. He died before dawn, his skin cold though the night was warm. Cambyses, furious, called it weakness, madness born of exhaustion. His command thundered through the camp, the strong will live, the weak will be forgotten. The empire does not bow to sand or spirits. But his men had seen enough. In the hush after the king's words, a murmur spread like poison. What if they were already dead, wandering in endless desert beyond the world of the living? That night, the wind carried laughter, soft, mocking, in a tongue none could understand. And the soldiers knew they were no longer alone in the sands. Darkness in the desert is not empty. It breathes. It moves. The Persians soon learned that night offered no rest, only deeper terror. The stars above burned bright, cold, indifferent, but between the dunes shadows stretched unnaturally long, shifting even when no fire flickered. At first came the whispers. Soft, almost tender, like the voices of wives and children calling from far away. Exhausted soldiers stumbled toward the sound, convinced they heard familiar names spoken on the wind. They never returned. Then the shapes appeared. At the edge of the campfire's glow, figures loomed, tall, robed in tatters, faces hidden beneath veils of sand. When challenged, they melted into the dunes. Yet when the men lay down to rest, they swore those same shapes hovered over them, breath cold against their skin. A sentry vanished on his watch. His spear remained planted in the sand, still upright, but the man himself was gone, not dragged, not slain, simply erased. Panic rippled through the ranks. Men clutched their amulets, muttering prayers to forgotten gods, begging for dawn. Cambyses raged, his voice a whip. There is no curse, no phantom. Only cowards who shame Persia. He ordered his generals to tighten the march, to keep the fires burning brighter. But even the flames betrayed them, sputtering, shrinking, as if smothered by unseen hands. On the fourth night, the army heard it, laughter. Not of men, but of something ancient, echoing across the dunes, mocking, circling closer with every gust of wind. And for the first time, even Cambyses turned his gaze toward the horizon, and in his eyes there flickered something his men had never seen before. Fear. By the fifth day of wandering blind, the desert began to play its cruelest trick. On the horizon, shimmering in the haze, appeared the promise of water, a vast lake, cool and still, fringed with palms heavy with dates. A shout rose from the front lines, and before Cambyses could bark an order, hundreds of men broke rank, stumbling towards salvation. But the closer they came, the farther it seemed. The lake rippled, the palms swayed, and then, nothing. Sand. Only endless sand. The soldiers fell to their knees, clawing at the ground, scooping up handfuls of dust as if it might turn to water in their mouths. Some never rose again. That night, the mirages returned in another form. Fires burned in the distance, golden and steady, as though another camp lay just beyond the dunes. Voices drifted through the dark, songs in a tongue no one recognized, deep and resonant, both mournful and triumphant. A company of scouts was sent to investigate. Hours passed. Dawn came. The voices stopped. The scouts never returned. But something did. Their footprints. Rows upon rows of footprints, leading back toward the Persian camp, and then circling around it, over and over, until the sand was patterned with spirals. The soldiers awoke to find these marks surrounding them like a noose. The desert was no longer indifferent. It was watching. At the heart of the dunes, the army stumbled upon the shattered bones of an ancient caravan, camels lying in twisted heaps, their riders little more than bleached skeletons. Among the ruins stood a broken column, carved with symbols neither Persian nor Egyptian. Men swore they saw fresh blood staining the stone, though when touched it was dry as dust. And in that moment, even the proudest generals admitted what the soldiers already knew. They had marched beyond the realm of men. They had stepped into a land where only the dead belonged. It began with a whisper, the hiss of grains against bronze, the sigh of the desert waking from sleep. Then the horizon darkened, not with clouds, but with a towering wall of sand, black and roaring, a beast rising to devour the world. Form ranks! Cambyses thundered, but his command was swallowed by the storm. The desert howled, shrieking like 1,000 tortured souls. Men clutched their shields, but the wind tore them away as if they were paper. Sand seared their eyes, filled their mouths, buried them alive in moments. Lightning split the sky, not white, but a sickly green that turned the dunes into a writhing sea. In that eerie light, soldiers swore they saw figures walking calmly through the chaos. Not Persians, not men at all, silhouettes of warriors in tattered armor, their hollow eyes glowing faintly, as though lit from within. They moved against the storm, untouched, drifting closer with each flash. One of Cambyses' generals broke, screaming prayers to Ahura Master as he fled into the storm. He vanished instantly, swallowed whole, but his voice lingered, carried on the wind, repeating his prayer until it warped into something inhuman, a chant too deep for any living throat. The army clung together, blinded, choking, as the sand rose higher than towers. Camels were ripped from their tethers and hurled into the blackness. Men were buried where they stood, their screams muffled beneath dunes that hadn't existed a moment before. And through it all, Cambyses sat astride his white horse, his eyes wide with a fury that masked his terror. He raised his sword to the heavens and roared at the storm, I am king of Persia. I command the world." But the world did not answer. The storm did. With laughter. Low, echoing, rolling across the dunes like the voices of the dead. When dawn came, half the army was gone. The survivors staggered into silence, the sand smooth and untouched, as if 50,000 men had never walked there at all. And in the heart of that silence, one soldier whispered the thought none dared speak aloud. "We are already buried." The storm left more than corpses buried in the dunes. It left madness. When the survivors gathered, their numbers were a shadow of what they had been. Faces were raw from sand, lips blackened with thirst, eyes wild with the look of hunted beasts. And worse, they no longer trusted one another. In the flickering glow of the night fires, arguments erupted like sparks. Some demanded they turn back, though no one knew the way. Others swore that only by pressing forward could they find salvation. Voices rose, steel hissed, and brothers who had marched side by side through a dozen battles drew blades against one another. Blood stained the sand before Cambyses could even shout for silence. But the king's words had lost their weight. His commands drifted on deaf ears, carried away by the same wind that had swallowed half his army. Men looked to other leaders now, not generals, but visionaries. One soldier claimed he had seen a river in the night, glowing like silver under the stars. He spoke with the fever of a prophet, urging his comrades to follow him eastward. Dozens obeyed, breaking ranks and disappearing into the dunes. By dawn, none had returned. Another group huddled around a silent captain whose eyes had turned strangely pale. He said nothing, yet the men around him whispered that he knew the way, that he marched within the shadows and could lead them to water. They followed him into the dark, leaving only footprints that seemed to fade faster than the wind could erase them. The army was no longer an army. It was a collection of broken souls, each haunted, each listening to voices only they could hear. And in the center of it all, Cambyses watched as his empire crumbled grain by grain, like sand slipping through an open hand. By nightfall, fewer than half remained by his side. And in the silence between the gusts of wind, the survivors heard it again, the laughter. Closer now. By the 8th day, the sun burned pale and sickly over the dunes. The survivors, a ragged dozen, stumbled into a depression between jagged ridges, a valley unlike any they had seen. Here, the sand was mixed with grey dust, and scattered across the ground were towering stone pillars, carved with symbols older than Persia itself. The air was strangely still. No wind, no whispering, only the faint hum of something alive beneath the earth. Men felt it under their feet, a vibration that made their bones ache. Some swore the shadows between the stones moved, just out of sight. One soldier stepped forward and traced the carvings. His finger trembled as he read the lines, scenes of men lost in a desert, their faces frozen in terror, being pulled into the ground by hands that weren't there. The soldiers recoiled. "These are warnings," one said. "Not stories." That night, the pillars cast long, impossible shadows under the moonlight. From between them, whispers rose again, louder this time, chanting in tongues that made the men's teeth ache. And then came the figures. Pale, half-seen, some mounted on skeletal camels, others walking barefoot over stone, moving in patterns that seemed to circle the survivors like predators. Cambyses shouted, but the sound was swallowed. Even his horse shied away, snorting, ears flat, as if it sensed the living ghosts. Men dropped to their knees, clutching each other, praying for the dawn that might never come. And in the center of the valley, just beyond the tallest pillar, a shadow moved differently from the others, deliberate, watching. It beckoned. The desert was no longer merely a trap. It had a will. At the heart of the valley, half buried in the dust, they found it. A fragment of stone unlike the rest, smooth, black as obsidian, its surface etched with spirals that seemed to twist when gazed upon. Around it lay shards of bronze, broken spears, and the skeletons of men who had died clutching at the same stone, their bony fingers locked in eternal grasp. One of Cambyses' generals bent to lift it, and the air itself seemed to shudder. The spirals flared faintly, glowing like embers, and a deep hum rippled through the stones. Every soldier felt it vibrate in his chest, like another heartbeat, one not his own. Suddenly the whispers were no longer distant. They poured directly into their ears, clear and commanding. A drink, follow, bow. As some soldiers dropped their weapons, eyes wide and glassy, as though the voice had reached inside and snuffed out their will. They staggered toward the stone, arms outstretched. Cambyses' white horse reared, screaming, eyes rolling in terror. Even the king himself staggered back, his face pale beneath the desert sun. Yet something in his pride, or his madness, drove him forward. He seized the black fragment with both hands, lifting it high as though it were a trophy of conquest. The valley answered. The pillars groaned, shifting like giants waking from sleep. Sand poured from their cracks, forming shapes, faces, hands, entire bodies rising from the ground. Shadows thickened, taking form, circling the survivors with hunger in their hollow eyes. And from the stone in Cambyses' grip came a voice, low and commanding, not in Persian, not in Egyptian, but in a tongue that seemed older than the desert itself. The soldiers fell to their knees, some in terror, some in worship. For the first time, the army no longer feared the desert. They feared their king. The moment Cambyses raised the relic, the night itself seemed to ignite. The pillars around them pulsed with faint light, as if veins of fire ran through their ancient stone. A sound like 1,000 voices chanting in unison filled the valley, though no lips moved. The soldiers broke. Some tore at their armor, stripping it away as though it burned their flesh. Others collapsed onto their faces, pressing their foreheads into the sand, whispering prayers that did not belong to their gods. One man stood and began to laugh, a hollow, rasping sound that carried across the dunes until his throat split and his body fell still. And then, from the shifting darkness, they appeared. Not a handful of shapes, not scattered whispers, but an entire host. Rank upon rank of spectral warriors, armor rusted and half buried in sand, eyes burning with cold fire. Their spears were jagged shadows, their banners torn but still carried proudly. 50,000 strong, they stood in silence, a mirror of the army that had once marched into the desert. The Persians watched in horror as these phantoms moved in perfect unison, kneeling before the black stone in Cambyses' hands. The earth trembled with their submission. The king's face twisted, pride, triumph, madness, as he held the relic aloft, drunk on the illusion of dominion. But the soldiers who still clung to their sanity saw the truth. The spirits were not kneeling to Cambyses. They were kneeling to the stone, to whatever ancient hunger had slept beneath the desert for centuries, waiting for mortal hands to lift it once more. And in that moment, the survivors knew they had not discovered treasure. They had unearthed a curse that had swallowed empires before them. The desert night became a temple. Around Cambyses, men tore strips of cloth from their tunics, binding them across their eyes, swaying and muttering in a tongue they had never known before. They circled the black stone like priests at an altar, cutting their palms and letting blood drip into the sand, as though feeding something beneath it. Others fled, scrambling over the dunes, their cries fading into the dark. None returned. Some claimed to see them fall to their knees halfway across the valley, their bodies twisting, spines arching, as invisible hands dragged them back toward the circle of pillars. Cambyses himself stood taller than ever, the obsidian shard clutched against his chest. His voice rang out like thunder, "Behold! Even the dead bow to me. Persia is eternal." His generals exchanged terrified glances, but none dared challenge him. His eyes burned with a strange light, feverish, inhuman. And as he spoke, the spectral army moved again. Their shields rose in unison, a wave of silence sweeping across the valley. Sand lifted from the ground, swirling around Cambyses like a crown of fire, shaping itself into a throne upon which he stood. The sight was terrible, or inspiring, a king seated above men and spirits alike. Yet beneath the ore was rot. The black stone throbbed in his hands, its spirals twisting faster, deeper, as if boring into his flesh. A dark stain crept up his arms, veins blackening as though poisoned. His voice grew deeper, layered with another tone that was not his own. And the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling every soldier's head. A bow. Bleed. Belong. Some obeyed. Some screamed. Some clawed at their ears until they collapsed, silent forever. In that moment, the Persians understood their king was no longer their king. He was becoming the desert's chosen. The valley erupted in chaos. No trumpet sounded, no command was given, but men turned upon each other as though possessed. Brothers who had fought side by side for years now slashed wildly with bronze blades, their screams echoing against the stone pillars. The sand drank deeply, dark and wet beneath their feet. Some fell to their knees before Cambyses, chanting, offering themselves to the black stone. They carved symbols into their skin with daggers, blood tracing the same spirals that glowed upon the relic. Their eyes rolled back, white as moonstone, as if their souls had already departed. Others resisted, swinging their swords not only at comrades but at shadows that moved too swiftly to be flesh. One soldier impaled an apparition, only for his weapon to pass through, yet when he looked down, his own chest was pierced, as if the blow had turned inward. He gasped, staggered, and collapsed, lifeless in the sand. The spectral host, 50,000 strong, did not attack. They only watched. Silent, patient, their hollow eyes fixed on the slaughter. With every drop of blood spilled, their forms grew sharper, clearer, more solid, while the living Persians began to blur at the edges, their outlines flickering in the moonlight as though they were fading. Cambyses, enthroned in his crown of sand, laughed as his army tore itself apart. His voice was no longer his own. It carried the weight of the storm, the depth of the earth, the hunger of the void. Yes, it boomed, echoing across the dunes, it become mine. Persia shall march forever. And as the night waned, the survivors realized with horror that their comrades who had fallen were rising again, not as men, but as pale figures joining the ghostly ranks. Their faces were the same, yet their eyes glowed cold, and their mouths whispered the same dreadful chant. Bow. Bleed. Belong. By dawn, the valley was a graveyard of echoes. The pillars still hummed with that dreadful chant, the spectral army stood in endless silence, and at their center Cambyses sat enthroned upon his shifting crown of sand, his face twisted into a mask that was no longer human. His eyes glowed like coals, and from his lips poured a voice that was both command and curse. A handful of survivors, fewer than 24, could bear it no longer. Their loyalty shattered, their fear greater than their king's wrath, they broke away. Scrambling over the dunes, they fled the valley in blind desperation, clutching their weapons as though steel could save them from the unseen. Behind them came the sounds, the clatter of phantom armor, the soft rhythm of countless ghostly feet moving in perfect unison. The lost army was marching again. One man turned back, screaming, and in the pale morning light he swore he saw it clearly. 50,000 dead Persians, their faces cracked and hollow, advancing in silence, spears pointed toward the living. His scream ended in a choking gasp as the sand beneath him opened and swallowed him whole. The others pressed on, staggering under the sun, but the desert itself betrayed them. Dunes shifted, paths vanished, and mirages rose before their eyes. Lakes, cities, even their own homes shimmering in the distance, always out of reach. Some ran toward them, weeping with joy, only to vanish into the haze. Still, a small knot of men endured, driven by sheer terror. They swore to themselves that if they could escape, if they could bring word of what had happened here, the world might remember them, the last witnesses to an empire swallowed whole. But even as they stumbled onward, a terrible realization gripped them. Perhaps the desert was letting them run. Perhaps it wanted its story told. And perhaps they, too, were already part of it. For a time, the fugitives believed they had escaped. The valley was behind them, the pillars lost to the horizon, and silence returned save for the hiss of sand beneath their feet. Hope flickered, fragile, trembling, as they pressed onward beneath the brutal sun. But by the second night, the truth revealed itself. One man awoke screaming, clawing at his forearm. By torchlight the others saw it, spirals, the same twisted patterns etched into the black stone, burned into his flesh as though carved by invisible hands. He swore he felt them moving under his skin, coiling deeper with every heartbeat. Before dawn, his body stiffened, his eyes turned pale, and he rose without a word to walk alone into the dunes. The rest began to notice signs upon themselves. Faint marks on their wrists. Whispers at the edge of hearing, soft and coaxing. A bow, bleed, belong. At first they tried to resist, shouting prayers into the night, plugging their ears with sand. But the voices were inside now. No barrier could shut them out. One by one, visions came. A soldier saw his wife standing on the dunes, arms open, calling him home. Another saw Persepolis, gates thrown wide, banners flying in triumph. Yet when he reached out, the city crumbled into dust, and the same 50,000 hollow-eyed specters marched through its ruins. Even the stars betrayed them. They shifted, twisting into shapes of spears and spirals, as if the heavens themselves bore the same curse. And the men began to ask the question they had dreaded since the storm. Had they ever left the valley at all? Or had the desert woven an illusion of escape, a cruel trick to stretch their torment further? By the time dawn broke, none of them spoke of survival. Only of whether they would fade as men or rise as shadows. By the third night, the fugitives were shadows of men. Their lips cracked from thirst, their eyes wild with terror, and their footsteps led in circles no matter which way they turned. One collapsed mid-stride, his body shuddering as the sand closed over him like water, leaving no trace he had ever walked the earth. Another laughed madly at nothing and simply vanished into the haze, his voice trailing off until it was swallowed by silence. Soon there were only two. They staggered side by side, bound not by brotherhood but by dread. Yet when the sun rose, one found himself walking alone. The other's footprints ended abruptly, as though he had stepped off the edge of the world. That lone survivor, his name lost to history, stumbled onward until he reached the edge of an oasis. There, half delirious, he collapsed beneath a dying palm. His tongue mumbled words that no man around him understood. Fragments of curses and prayers mingled together. The army marches still. The king of sand waits. No escape, no escape. Nomads found him, carried him to safety, but his mind never returned. He spoke of a city buried in the dunes, of pillars that sang, of soldiers with hollow eyes waiting for the world to remember them. When he died, the tribes buried him quickly, fearing the marks that had begun to bloom across his skin, spirals, faint but unmistakable. Yet his ramblings spread. Caravans carried whispers of their lost army of Cambyses, as swallowed by the desert, cursed to march forever. And so the tale lingered, century after century, drawing explorers, kings, and dreamers into the sands, each seeking the truth, each risking the same fate. For the desert never forgets what it has claimed. Centuries passed, yet the desert never released its secret. The nomads carried the tale like embers in the wind, a story told by firelight, when the dunes glowed silver under the moon. Travelers spoke of nights when the earth trembled faintly, as if thousands of feet still struck the sand in rhythm, the phantom march of a long-dead army. Arab chroniclers recorded the whispers with solemn ink, the lost army of Cambyses, 50,000 strong, devoured by the wrath of the desert. Some wrote that they had angered the gods, others claimed they had discovered a forbidden city and were chained to it forever. In the bazaars of Cairo and Damascus, merchants swore they had seen strange spirals carved on stones half-buried in drifting sands, the same patterns that once burned themselves into the skin of doomed soldiers. Caravans reported stranger things still. On cloudless nights, when the stars burned cruel and bright, some swore they saw a procession on the horizon, dark figures marching silently in endless lines, their banners tattered, their spears catching the moonlight. Yet when the caravan moved closer, the vision dissolved into waves of sand. One tale told of a trader who followed the phantom army for 3 nights, believing he would uncover hidden treasure. On the 4th night, his camels returned to camp without him, their saddlebags empty, their hides marked with faint spirals as if the desert itself had branded them. So the legend grew, feeding on fear and fascination. Scholars debated it, kings dreamed of finding it, and wanderers risked their lives for it. But the desert kept its silence, as if amused by men who thought they could outlast eternity. And through all those years, the same refrain echoed in hushed voices. The army marches still, beneath the sands, beneath the stars. By the 12th century, the legend of Cambyses' lost army was no longer just a whisper by the fire, it was a beacon for the bold and the reckless. Tales of buried gold, forgotten temples, and an entire army frozen beneath the dunes lured men into the desert's burning embrace. One of the earliest seekers was a wealthy emir from Cairo. He gathered 50 riders, camels heavy with water and supplies, and vowed to return with proof of the ghostly legion. His men sang songs of glory as they vanished into the Libyan sands. Weeks passed, then months. At last, one camel staggered back into the city alone, its flanks torn open, its eyes wide and white with terror. The emir and his men were never seen again. Another account spoke of a band of Persian pilgrims who, guided by a dream, marched westward, believing they would find the soldiers standing guard at the gates of a lost city. Their caravan left tracks in the sand that lasted for days, until a sandstorm swept through, erasing every sign. No bones, no banners, not a single scrap was ever found. Only the spirals, faintly etched into exposed rock near where they were last seen. Arab historians wrote of these disappearances with a mix of awe and dread. Some claimed the army was cursed to lure the living into their fate, feeding the desert with souls century after century. Others whispered of a city beneath the dunes, built of obsidian and fire, where the dead still march, waiting for a king who will never come. Yet each vanishing only sharpened the hunger of those who remained. What force could swallow not just men, but memory itself? And if the desert was their grave, might it not also guard their unimaginable treasures? The desert answered only with silence and shifting sands. The merchants of the great caravans swore that the desert was never truly silent. By day, the wind howled across the dunes, carrying with it the hiss of shifting grains. But it was in the dead of night, when the fires burned low and the stars crowned the sky, that the whispers grew into something else. Travelers told of faint sounds drifting up from beneath the sand, the distant clash of steel, the roll of war drums, the mournful cry of trumpets. Some heard voices, chanting in tongues long dead, their words carried on a rhythm too precise to be the work of wind alone. It was said that if you pressed your ear against the dune, you could feel the earth tremble with the march of phantom feet. One caravan leader, hardened by years on the trade routes, dismissed the stories as drunken fancies, until one night his men woke screaming. They swore the ground beneath their tents had pulsed like a beating heart, and that a line of ghostly figures had passed through camp, leaving their footprints glowing faintly before vanishing into the night. The leader himself later admitted he had heard a horn blast so loud it rattled the very air, yet when the dawn came, the desert was as still as a tomb. Tales spread quickly. Some swore that these sounds were omens, warnings to stay away from the cursed resting place of Cambyses' army. Others believed it was a summons, that the lost soldiers were calling out for the living to join them, to swell their endless march beneath the sands. Whatever the truth, those who lingered too long listening often vanished. Camps found abandoned, camels wandering untethered, and spirals once again, scratched into stone, into bone, into the very air of fear itself. And so the desert became not just a grave, but a stage where the living and the dead played out a drama unseen, the echoes of a war that time refused to forget. By the 15th century, whispers of Cambyses' lost army had reached the courts of Europe. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land spoke of deserts alive with ghosts, of caravan traders who trembled at the mention of spirals in the sand. Curiosity and ambition merged, gold, glory, and the lure of eternal fame drove knights and scholars alike toward the Libyan expanse. A small band of French knights, guided by maps half-written in Arabic and Persian, marched alongside Arab guides. Their camels groaned under supplies, their armor glinting pale under the desert sun. By day, the dunes were beautiful, cruelly golden. By night, they became labyrinths of shadow and sound. The first evening, one of the knights awoke to hear a trumpet far beneath the sand. He shook his companions awake, but all heard it, faint at first, then swelling, echoing as if 1,000 warriors were moving beneath their feet. The guides fell to their knees, muttering prayers to Allah and saints alike, warning that the desert did not forgive the living. Days passed, and the band pressed on. They stumbled upon half-buried pillars, spirals etched deep into the stones, and scattered bones that seemed impossibly fresh. Sometimes at dusk, shadows moved against the dunes, not of men, but of men who should have been dead for centuries. The knights drew their swords, but the shapes vanished like smoke, leaving only sand in their wake. And always, there was the rhythm beneath the earth, faint at first, then unmistakable, the march of the lost army, relentless and eternal, calling across the sands. The Crusaders realized the stories were true. Cambyses' legion had not disappeared. It had merely slipped into a world between worlds, a desert that swallowed time and spat out whispers. Fear gnawed at them. Some guides refused to go further. Some knights lost their minds, staring into dunes as if they saw cities rising and falling, armies forming and dissolving. Yet those who survived felt a strange compulsion to continue, the desert's call was stronger than reason. And in that vast, golden wasteland, the boundary between hunter and hunted began to blur. Centuries have passed, yet the desert never forgets. The dunes shift and shimmer, hiding tombs, temples, and the remnants of a king who defied gods. Travelers, explorers, and scholars have all vanished in search of the lost army of Cambyses, their cries swallowed by sand and wind. In the moonlight, the dunes seem alive. Shadows twist into figures of soldiers with hollow eyes, moving in perfect unison. Faint trumpets echo from beneath the sand, drums of an army that marches between worlds. The spirals, etched in stone, bone, and flesh, whisper the same command: Abo. Bleed. Belong. Nomads tell stories by firelight, of caravans disappearing and returning with tales of ghostly formations and pale soldiers walking silently alongside them. Arab chroniclers, European knights, and wandering adventurers all wrote of it, yet none captured its full horror. For the army is eternal, its march unbroken. Some who return speak only in riddles, their eyes wide, their tongues tasting sand. Others never return at all. And the desert listens, shifting its dunes to hide its treasures, its curses, and its kings. And still, the wind carries a refrain, faint but insistent. We march forever, we wait, we remember, and we call. The lost army of Cambyses moves on, unseen yet ever present. A legend, a warning, a curse, and for anyone who dares to follow its whispers, the desert offers only one certainty: it will claim you, as it has claimed all who came before. The march never ends. Persia. 1. 2. 3. 4. 5. 6. 7. 8. 9. 10. 11. 12. 13. 14. 15. 16. 17. 18. 19. 20. 21. 22. 23. 24. 25. 26. 27. 28. 29. 30. 31. 32. 33. 34. 35. 36. 37. 38. 39. 40. 41. 42. 43. 44. 45. 46. 47. 48. 49. 50. 51. 52. 53. 54. 55. 56. 57. 58. 59. 60. 61. 62. 63. 64. 65. 66. 67. 68. 69. 70. 71. 72. 73. 74. 75. 76. 77. 78. 79. 80. 81. 82. 83. 84. 85. 86. 87. 88. 89. 90. 91. 92. 93. 94. 95. 96. 97. 98. 99. 100. 101. 102. 103. 104. 105. 106. 107. 108. 109. 110. 111. 112. 113. 114. 115. 116. 117. 118. 1